already, so that we have plenty of time. So I'm Yael Erdoff. I'm the director of the Sterling Institute for Jewish Studies in Modern Israel, and I'm thrilled that we're having this panel and book discussion on Wandering Jews, Global Jewish Migration that our own longtime affiliate Steve Gold co-edited, and our own Kirsten Fermaglich is made a major contribution to from our own local communities. And it's great to have Dr. Gil Ribak and Laura Limonic here. Limonic, sorry. The reason I was thrown off is I wanted to quickly announce before I introduce you all our next 3 events for the end of the semester. So we're impromptu going to have a panel on the Israeli elections this Sunday, which will send you information about the 4th election in 2 years. But Dr. Alon Tal and Eli Rekes will be joining me. And then on Thursday, we're having our annual Holocaust, Rabin Holocaust lecture with Dr. Diana Dumitriu. We'll be talking about neighbors in difficult times, Jews and Gentiles in the borderlands of the Soviet Union or Romania during the Holocaust. And then on Friday, we'll have our 5th annual Sterling Institute Undergraduate Research Conference, where we have 15 of our students presenting their research with a lot of faculty acting as discussants, and everyone's welcome to join. And we're going to have a keynote on one of our alumni who graduated 10 years ago and has a fantastic job in the State Department. So if you're not on our list and would like to get our emails, you can reach out to us. Ariana will put a link in the chat for you to go to. And when we're all finished, please, and while you're hearing people's presentations, please, we welcome you to ask your questions in the Q&A. And then I'll help try to field those in the end. And I'm sure there'll be lots of questions, and we welcome those from community members, students, and faculty. So let's get started, because this is going to be a stimulating and exciting panel. Our first speaker is going to be Professor Steven Gold. He's professor and graduate program director in the Department of Sociology at MSU. And as I said, he's been for many, many years an affiliate faculty of the Sterling Institute. His scholarly interests include international migration, ethnic economies, ethnic community development, qualitative field methods, and visual sociology. Professor Gold is the author, co-author, or co-editor of 9 books, including The Israeli Diaspora, that was published by Routledge in 2002 and won the Thomas and Zanecki Award for the American Sociological Association's International Migration section for the best book on international migration in 2003. He's the chair of 22 PhD dissertations and author over 100 journal articles and book chapters. And Gold received the Charles Horton Cooley Award for Distinguished Scholarship in Sociology from the Michigan Sociology Association in 2007, and the Distinguished Career Award from the American Sociological Association International Migration section in 2019. So it's quite a prolific person. Next, we have Professor Laura Limonic, Associate Professor of Sociology at the College of Old Westbury of the State University of New York. Her research is in the area of contemporary immigration to the United States and the integration trajectories of ethnic and ethno-religious groups. Her recent book, Kugel and Frijoles, Latino Jews in the United States, explores issues of ethnicity, race, class, and religious community building among Latino Jews immigrants in Boston, New York, Miami, and Southern California. Laura's current work examines the rise of Chabad in Latin America as an avenue for Jewish identity construction and communal life among Jews in Latin America, Association for Jewish Studies, and the Templeton Trust. She received her PhD in sociology from CUNY Graduate Center in 2014, and she has a Bachelor of Arts degree in Latin American Studies from Brandeis University and a Master's of International Affairs degree from Columbia University. In addition to academic research, Laura has an extensive background in public policy, research, and advocacy. So I really look forward to Laura's talk. And then we'll have Gil Ribak, an associate professor of Judaic Studies at the University of Arizona. Born and raised in Israel, he came to the US on a Fulbright Dissertator Fellowship and complete a doctoral degree in history at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. After graduation, Ribak taught at Washington University in St. Louis as the Lewin Postdoctoral Fellow and as the Schusterman Postdoctoral Fellow at the University of Arizona. Before returning to the University of Arizona for a tenure-track position, he served as director of the Institute on Israeli-American Jewish Relations at the American Jewish University in Los Angeles and taught at Oberlin College. His book, Gentile New York, The Images of Non-Jews Among Jewish Immigrants, was published by Rutgers University Press in 2012, and his articles appeared in journals such as AJS Review, American Jewish History, East European Jewish Affairs, Israel Studies Forum, Journal of American Ethnic History, Poland, a Journal of Polish Jewish Studies, and Modern Judaism, among others. He's also published book chapters in books such as Germany and the Americas, Culture, Politics, and History, War and Peace in Jewish Tradition, From the Ancient World to the Present, Wealth and Poverty in Jewish Tradition, Studies in Jewish Civilization, American Jewry, Transcending the European Experience, Restructuring the Old Country, American Jewry in the Post-Holocaust Decades, and Anti-Zionism, Anti-Semitism, and the Dynamics of Delegitimization. We next have our own Professor Kirsten Fermaglich, who's Professor of History and Jewish Studies at MSU. She's also currently the Associate Director of the Sterling Institute. She's the author of A Rosenberg by Any Other Name, NYU Press 2018, which won the Saul Wiener Prize for the Best Book in American Jewish History from the American Jewish Historical Society in 2019, and American Dreams and Nazi Nightmares, Early Holocaust Consciousness and Liberal America from 1957 to 1965, Brandeis University Press in 2006. And with Lisa Fine, she also co-edited the Norton Critical Edition of Betty Friedan, The Feminine Mystique in 2013. She is currently co-editor of the journal American Jewish History, along with Daniel Sawyer and Adam Mendelson. So we have very extraordinary 4 speakers with us today. And our first speaker will be Steve Gold. So thank you so much, and please write your Q&A, and we will have a really stimulating discussion when they're done. Thank you so much for this wonderful book and for organizing this panel.
Thank you very much, Yael, for the introduction. I also have a few more people you'll have to hear thanked before I get into the paper, which is called Recent Advancements in Jewish Migration Studies. I wish to thank the Kasdan Institute at the University of Southern California and its director, Steve Ross, for undertaking the publication of this volume. I also express my gratitude to the Michael and Elaine Serling Institute for Jewish Studies in Modern Israel and its director, Yael Aronoff, for organizing the event. I express my gratitude to the College of Arts and Letters, James Madison College, the College of Social Science, the Residential College in Arts and Humanities, the Office of Inclusion and Intercultural Initiatives, the Department of History, and Peace and Justice Studies. I wish to thank the chapter authors for contributing their work for inclusion of wandering Jews, and Laura Limonic, Gil Ribak, and Kirsten Fermaglich for presenting their chapters this evening. Finally, I wish to express my gratitude to the MSU Department of Sociology and Aaron McBride, its chair, for co-sponsoring this event. Okay, 3 factors have contributed to recent growth and intellectual development in the study of Jewish migration. First is the expansion and broadening of migration studies in general that has occurred in recent decades. Second is the increased financial and institutional support for Jewish studies. Finally, a third reason for the field's growth is ongoing instances of Jewish migration both within and across national borders that compel immigrant aid organizations and migration scholars to learn about and assist their peripatetic landsmen. A number of leading scholars have celebrated the transformation of migration studies, noting that the topic currently examines a much wider range of disciplines, or involves a much larger range of disciplines than ever before. Observers of migration studies assert that even as the field has expanded and diversified, it has managed to become more rigorous, more international in focus, and more firmly grounded in theory. Moreover, this scholarly endeavor has maintained a significant degree of integration and continuity across disciplines, nations, and world regions. As a consequence, its methods and findings are increasingly applied to a broad range of concerns. Migration research informs policy making by governments, NGOs, and immigrant aid organizations. It also counters the assertions of anti-immigrant movements. Given the recent upturn in interest and support for studies of migration, a variety of disciplinary associations have established sections, committees, publications, conferences, awards, and others endeavors devoted to the study of migration. This reflects a significant transformation of the field's foci over a relatively short time. As the authors of Rugged Migration History point out, until the 70s, the study of migration was fixed almost exclusively on Western Europe and US, was androcentric, elitist, overwhelmingly devoted to workforce issues, and indifferent to migrants' interpretations of their own experiences. Subjects such as stratification, slavery, refugees, forced migration, and remigration were rejected as suitable topics for migration research. The fact that a significant fraction of contemporary migration scholars are themselves migrants has helped move migration studies from a narrowly framed undertaking to one now much more ambitious and wider in scope. By and large, scholars who have personal or familial connections to migration are much better equipped to understand the complex realities encountered by migrants than those with little immediate connection to the process. As a consequence of historical and social factors, Jews have been well represented among those who have developed the ways through which migration research has been conducted and how knowledge resulting from this examination has been put to use. Historian Tobias Brinkman has advanced our understanding of how Jewish scholars and activists have fashioned the study of migration. Drawing on his research on the Jewish population of Chicago during the 19th century, Brinkman demonstrated how Jewish communal organizations' efforts to assist recently arrived co-ethnics led to the development of many of the frameworks and methods that are now used in ethnic migration and community studies. Arriving in Chicago in the 1840s, Jews from Bavaria recognized the social and economic needs encountered by members of their community as they sought to adjust to life in the U.S. Drawing upon pre-migration traditions, they formed self-help associations like the United Hebrew Relief Association to provide struggling co-religionists with social support. Through a detailed examination of the organization's annual reports, Brinkman discovered that in order to accomplish its goals more efficiently, the organization shifted its structure from that of a voluntary association to a professional body. By the 1880s, professional social workers and administrators were replacing volunteers. The communal representatives visited families and their homes to study poverty and offer advice about hygiene and education. Such a change, Brinkman asserts, correlated with a shift from stereotypical perceptions of migrants to more differentiated assessments of social problems. In so doing, Jewish immigrant organizations involved in communal self-help developed the approaches that are used by a wide range of migration scholars today. As Brinkman notes, the first detailed studies about immigration in industrializing cities, so-called surveys, were compiled by social workers in settlements in London, New York, and Chicago after 1880. When pioneering urban sociologists like Lewis Wirth and other students at the Chicago School began to conduct field research in Chicago's immigrant neighborhoods in the 1920s, they acknowledged the work of communal organizations in representing different immigrant groups and social settlements. In order to record, document, and apply practical information about Jewish immigrants and their resettlement, Jewish communal organizations commissioned the writing of detailed studies about the experience of migrant Jews. For example, in 1943, the American Jewish Committee commissioned Mark Wichsneiser, himself a German Jewish immigrant with decades of experience assisting migrants in both Europe and the US, to compile a survey of Jewish migration as a reference to inform the resettlement of Jews in the US after World War II. According to Brinkman, Wischnitzer's book, To Dwell in Safety, remains the most comprehensive study of Jewish migration between 1800 and 1948. Following Brinkman's description of the Jewish communal organization origins of migration studies, we see how an array of Jewish scholars and aid workers contributed in important ways to the growth, conceptual richness, and methodological advancement of the interdisciplinary study of migration. At the same time, Brinkman reminds us to recognize the significant contributions of members of other groups who documented the experience of their own and other migrant ethnic and racial populations. Among these are Florian Znamecki, Tomatso Shibatani, Ian Kwan, W.E.B. Du Bois, Elaine Locke, Arthur Hart, Fawcett, and Hannah Arendt. Immigrant scholars, research on a broad range of communities laid groundwork for contemporary inquiry in migration studies. Aware of the enhanced interest in and endorsement of studies of migration, a growing number of scholars and students began to produce works in migration, Jewish studies, ethnic studies, and related topics. As Eric Cohen, Brinkman, and others contend, the growth in migration studies has yielded a productive exchange and cross-fertilization of concepts, terminology, analytic models, and methods between researchers concerned with a variety of groups. Finally, scholars interested in the application of recently developed approaches in migration scholarship have chosen to revisit established concepts and works in the field. Their systematic reevaluation of classic studies helps contemporary scholars understand the origins of their field's approaches to research and analysis. In this way, scholars are able to apply contemporary perspectives to investigation of historical communities and concerns. A second reason for the expansion of Jewish migration studies is the availability of increased levels of financial and institutional support. Philanthropists, institutions of higher learning, academic associations, publishers, students, and audiences interested in works on migration have contributed much to the growth of Jewish migration studies. While a sizable fraction of this programming has been driven by the largesse of Jewish donors, it is important to point out that there are positions and programs in institutions, both private and public, where external funding has not played a role. The allocation of funding directly from colleges and university budgets demonstrates that such institutions regard the field of Jewish studies to be a fundamental component of higher learning. This increase in resources has generated opportunities for training, employment, and publication for scholars involved in Jewish studies generally and Jewish migration research in particular. The Association of Jewish Studies, which began in 1969 with 47 members, now has 1,800. The association's website lists more than 200 Jewish studies programs or departments and 230 endowed positions at North American colleges and universities. Data from the 2000 National Jewish Population Study indicates that 40% of Jewish students take a Jewish studies course during their academic careers. Relating the field's broad appeal, a number of students taking Jewish studies courses and majoring or minoring in Jewish studies are not themselves Jewish. A third reason for the continued activity of scholars of Jewish migration is that Jewish communities persist in migrating, both within and across borders. An analysis of ongoing patterns of Jewish migration is important both for practical and scholarly reasons. Indicating Jews' high level of recent involvement with international migration, Pew notes that while only 5% of Christians and 3% of Muslims globally have moved internationally during their lifetime, some 25% of all living Jews no longer reside in their country of birth. Since the 1950s, Jewish migrants have continued their long record of migration to the U.S. and other countries. From the 1950s to the 1960s to the 1990s, the largest migrant population were Russian-speaking Jews. They settled in Israel, the U.S., Canada, Australia, and Germany. Since the 1990s, Jewish migrants from France, Israel, Iran, Latin America, the Maghreb, Syria, Yemen, South Africa, and Central Asia have settled in Israel, North America, Europe, Australia, and other locations. As recent arrivals and barriers of cultural traditions relatively uncommon in their points of settlement, the ability of these new migrants to integrate into the host population, Americanized Eastern European Jews, has been limited. Making matters even more complex, recent Jewish migrants' arrival occurred during a time of increased segmentation and diversity within local Jewish communities. New synagogues, Jewish associations, and economic niches name disparate ways of life, forms of religious practice, cultural orientations, expression of nationality, sexuality, politics, and other aspects of being. Faced with such challenges, Jewish secular and public community agencies, youth programs, synagogues, and immigrant aid organizations have been informed by Jewish migration research, have aided in the resettlement of thousands of Jewish and non-Jewish migrants in Israel, Europe, and Australia, and North and South America. In sum, the recent growth and diversity in studies of Jewish migration can be traced to transformations in the way that migration scholarship is conducted, to increases in funding and institutional support for Jewish migration scholarship, and to the ongoing migrations of Jewish people throughout the world. The authors featured in Wandering Jews are leaders in the development of inventive scholarship on Jewish migration. While we don't have time to include all of those scholars this afternoon, we are very fortunate to have three presenters. The first is Limonic, who compares the experiences of post-World War II Jewish immigrants from the former Soviet Union, Latin America, and Israel living in the US. The second presenter is Gil Ribak. He offers a poignant analysis rooted in the historical perspectives of the 21st century to reconstruct the evolution of Eastern European Jewish migrants' views of Germans, from admiration to foreboding, during their travel from the Pale of Settlement to the US in the late 19th and early 20th century. Our final presenter is Kirsten Fermaglich. She examines the experience of Jewish academics and their families building lives in communities in American college towns from the late 1960s to the present, with a primary focus on East Lansing, Michigan. The topics of these presentations reflect considerable diversity in terms of location, historical period, and theoretical and methodological approach. At the same time, each embodies the energy and excitement that underlies the recent growth and creativity generated in this field to advance the study of Jewish migration and migration studies more generally. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Steve. I didn't think I'd have to, but I'll introduce again, and we look forward to your talk, Laura. Thank you so much.
Great. Well, thank you for hosting me. I'm very excited to be here for really so many of the reasons that Steve said. In large part, just sort of thinking on a larger scale about the different ways to think about migration, and particularly Jewish migration. So I'm going to share my screen, and I hope that it works. Let's see. There we go. Everyone can see everything that I've been doing. Okay. And I'm going to a slideshow. Let's okay, here we go. Okay, so a little bit of this, and just going to give a little bit of a background of what this chapter and this particular project is about. I looked at three different immigrant groups: Latin American Jews, Israeli Jews, and Jews from the former Soviet Union. And I put this picture up not only because, let's go back, not only to show that there are Jews everywhere, but also to show really the size of North American Jewish population compared to some of the other countries, and what that means in terms of shaping Jewish identity and shaping a Jewish community and Jewish scholarship. So in many ways, it's migrants have come to North America from all over the world, Jewish migrants, non-Jewish migrants. Since 1965, we've seen the sort of second largest wave of immigrants come. And among those immigrants are Jewish immigrants. But they've come to a place from these other countries where Jewish life is sort of part of the larger civil religion of the United States. So I was really interested in understanding sort of what happens when they come, right? How does their Jewish identity change? Does it change? How is Jewish identity constructed? So sort of how can the experience of these immigrants, what can their experiences tell us in terms of the kinds of factors that affect the construction of identity, of an ethno-religious identity and ethno-religious communities? So in my big study on Latin American Jews, I looked at a lot of the larger structural factors that affect community building and identity building. And I wanted to sort of take that a step further and think about what happens here in the United States. So immigrants are coming to a country that structurally is much different than where they're from. primarily Israeli immigrants, Latino immigrants, and FSU immigrants, or Jews from the former Soviet Union. So they're coming into a country where the social religious landscape is very different, where religious pluralism is really a norm that's enshrined in our Constitution, where the Judaism, for the most part, is part of our larger sort of monolithic civil religion, and where the ethnic and racial landscape is such that to insert themselves within a sort of racial hierarchy, Jewish immigrants sort of learn the lay of the land very quickly, and also learn that for the most part, Jewish ethnicity is oftentimes an ethnicity that is not for all immigrants, but is an ethnicity that is often a sort of factor in upward mobility. So 14% of Jewish adults are immigrants. That's very similar to the number of immigrants in the percentage of immigrants in the United States. As a result, we sort of need to, when we think about migration and Jewish identity and Jewish community, what we really need to think about is how are new immigrants shaping Jewish life today? So I really wanted to look at this in thinking about assimilation. And assimilation in a sort of new way of thinking about assimilation. So what happens to Jewish identity when immigrants, I can't go back. Oops, excuse me for 1 minute. Okay, so I wanted to know what happens to Jewish identity? How does it change? Because part of the migration process involves a change in your identity. And then how do American Jewish culture and communal structures affect the Jewish experience? And then I also really wanted to understand, how do immigrant groups differ from native-born American Jews? Are they different? Do they eventually look like native-born American Jews? And unlike most of the projects I do, where I have a sort of an idea of what I want to do and I dig around in the data and then I think more, I sort of piece it together, this project really came from a larger theoretical background and sort of theoretical method. It's more of a theoretical methodology that I thought about how I thought about assimilation theory. I thought about assimilation through religion and a lot of the work that has come out of the new immigrant religion assimilation. And I really wanted to think about, well, does this apply to new Jewish immigrants also? So I was very, very interested in thinking about how, in many ways, we know that religion is an avenue for assimilation for so many immigrant groups. But what happens to Jewish immigrant groups and from diverse sending countries? Will they immigrate, or will they assimilate differently? And sort of what aspects of their Jewish identity will change or not change? So I used the Pew Research Center study, and I broke down the categories, and I looked at and native immigrant generations were native first generation, the second generation, and then I used two summative scales where I wanted to think about two factors that I identified as factors that are sort of leading in Jewish identity. So a factor of religiosity and a factor of communal attachment. These are also factors that are found in larger, other larger studies of Jewish identity. And then I use these factors to do some statistical regressions to think about, which groups had higher religiosity or higher communal attachment, while I controlled for a host of factors like age, education, socioeconomic status. And so overall, this is sort of what I began to come up with. So this is a breakdown. So 68% of Jews in the United States were native born, almost 20% are second generation. That means that at least one of their parents was born in another country, and 12.5 or 13% are foreign born. And this is oftentimes the difference in the numbers really has to do with the groups that I've chosen to concentrate on, which is why on the larger scale, there's 14% and this is 12.5%. So of these people, it's the breakdown is this breakdown. So overall, and this is one of the things that I expected to find, and that I did find, was that that the Jewish immigrants resemble to some extent non-Jewish immigrants, right? Immigrants are younger. So this is wrong. Foreign-born are younger than native-borns. Native-born are slightly more likely to have a BA. And native-borns are more likely to identify with Reform Judaism than with conservative movements. Again, for a number of reasons. The conservative movement is really an American movement, and oftentimes, like Reform Judaism, there is higher levels of religiosity that might be expected. So I'm going to get into some of the construction of the scales, and talk a little bit more in depth about, you know, why I think some things, why people might identify or have stronger identities in one factor or another. So I constructed the Pew survey. Asks a bunch of questions about religious rights, and I summed all of these scales there, and they all have an alpha score that's greater than 78. So this was the scale that measures religiosity, and this is the scale that measures sort of peoplehood and communal identity. And I use two factors here that are important, but will skew the communal identity of Israelis perhaps a little bit more strongly than some of the other ones. But because Israel has served as a motherland for so many Jews in the diaspora, particularly Latin American Jews, and to some extent Jews from the former Soviet Union who have a lot of family in Israel, I thought that this was a very important factor to put in. So what it shows is that there's a clear path towards assimilation. So I looked at native-borns, first generation, so they were born abroad, and then second generations. So first generation Jewish immigrants have the highest Jewish ethnic identity and Jewish religious identities. In other words, they scored higher on those scales than second generation and then native born. So the ones that scored the lowest were the native borns. So what does that mean? They were more likely, all of the immigrants were more likely to have said that they either light candles on Shabbat or fast on Yom Kippur or attend synagogue, or some or all, right? Because it's a scale. And just go back so we can see the communal identity. The same with communal or sense of peoplehood. Immigrants were more likely to report that being Jewish was important, had greater importance in their life, or being part of a Jewish community, or their number of close friends that are Jewish. So any number of these would give them a higher score. Now, on the one hand it's surprising, but on the other hand it's not surprising at all. And the reason it's not surprising is because we know from a lot of the literature on immigration that one of the ways that people integrate into the new country is through religious organizations. So even if they didn't attend or had high levels of religiosity in their home countries, when they arrive to a new country, this is their sort of avenue for integration for a number of reasons. This is where they have networks. This is where they feel like there's a sense of kin or home or peoplehood. They might find some synagogues, temples, churches are sources of mutual aid. Also, what happens is that, for example, for Israeli Jews, as Steve Gold points out in his research, is that sometimes practicing these rites is a way to connect them to home. Right, to connect them to Israel, that perhaps in Israel they didn't light candles on Shabbat, but now they're away from home, and this is a way to connect them to their homeland. But what we see is that this begins to wane. And we know this, that among non-religiously observant Jews, people might belong to a synagogue, but that doesn't necessarily mean that at home they're practicing religious rites. They also might not necessarily feel like their life is is filled with not only Jewish rites, but Jewish. Their life is not so ethnically Jewish, because as you assimilate over time, you become part of the larger population. If your friends are, unless you live in areas where there's higher levels of religiosity, or you work in areas of within Jewish community, your friends might not all be Jewish. It might not be as important to you, and that's what we find over time. So I broke this down between groups, and this is where some of the differences come out. Among Israeli Jews, they have strong religious and ethnic identities. I think the ethnic identity, in large part, is probably driven by the Israeli questions. But we also find from some qualitative studies that Israeli Jews have a hard time finding sort of a proximal host among American Jews. They don't necessarily feel that American Jews are like them. So they do have strong sort of Jewish ethnic identities, and probably in large part because they don't feel like they're part of the larger American Jewish community. But again, over time, this changes. Synagogue membership is high. And as I mentioned before, religious rights are often seen as ties to Israel. Interestingly, Jews from the former Soviet Union come from, I talked a little bit about in the beginning, about how we need to think about the sort of structural factors from the sending countries as well as the structural factors here in the receiving countries. So they have higher Jewish and religious ethnic identities and native borns. And these factors that drive these higher religious identities are rituals and practices. So in large part, this may be driven by the fact that this was not something they did in the former Soviet Union. We know that a lot of the agencies and the help that Jews from the former Soviet Union that helped Jews from the former Soviet Union integrate into the United States were oftentimes religious organizations. They oftentimes, we know that children of immigrants or the younger children within families were given funds to go to yeshivas. So all of these could have a factor. Another factor, and this is sort of coming from my own new research, is that Chabad has played a pretty important role in driving religious practices of Jews from the former Soviet Union. Even if they're not necessarily very, very observant, they tend to take part in Chabad more and more over time. And the factors that really drive the higher ethnic identities is the sense of peoplehood. So a majority of Jews from the former Soviet Union felt like they had a large sense of Jewish peoplehood. Latino Jews had lower ethnic and religious identities than native born. And this I found very interesting, in large part because my research showed that even though Latin American Jewish immigrants have lower levels of religiosity, they have very strong sort of Jewish ethnic and Jewish ethno-religious identities. However, like Israeli Jews, they don't find a sort of perfect proximal host here, and they don't necessarily feel like they're part of the larger Jewish American community, which is probably what's driving this sort of scoring of a low ethnic identity. And then there's also an evidence that new ethnic group identities are emerging, and this survey doesn't necessarily capture this. In large part, areas where there are a lot of Latin American Jews have new Latino Jewish communities that are forming, and some of them are more have higher levels of religiosity. Chabad is also making some inroads within this immigrant population, but in areas like Southern California or Southern Florida, South Florida, and Miami in particular, we see that there's sort of new ethnic identities that are forming where the Latino Jews are able to form a group that is has strong ethnic identity, but not necessarily a strong American Jewish ethnic identity. So sort of coming back to this idea of assimilation and the theory behind this. So I really looked at this in terms thinking about how immigrants assimilate over time. At the same time, they also change the structure of where they land. And I find that it happens among Jewish institutions and communities also. As immigrants are absorbed and also learn to navigate life in the new land, when there is enough of them, right? If particularly, for example, here in Miami, where there's a number of immigrant groups, Israeli Jews, a number of Russian Jews, and Latino Jews, they also begin to change the way we think about Jewish ethnicity and Jewish life, how rites are practiced, what makes somebody Jewish, what religious rites are more important in building a Jewish identity than others. How different levels of religiosity. As more people join synagogues, this tends to happen also as part of the assimilation process. Many of these immigrants didn't necessarily belong to synagogues in their home country, and to join a synagogue is a very American thing to do, to pay this kind of money. So Jewish groups are following, so Jewish groups are really following the sort of path that their predecessors did, and assimilating, but also assimilating into the way Jewish religion is practiced in the United States, but also changing the way that Jewish life is practiced here in the United States. So that is. And I think in areas with large communities, we begin to see how new immigrants and will change Jewish communities and Jewish American culture.
Thank you so much. Gil, you're next with Cleanliness Like That of the Germans, Eastern European Jews' Views of Germans and the Dynamics of Migration and Disillusionment.
Thank you so much, Yael. And just a second, I think I need to share my screen. Thank you so much, Yael and Steve. I'm sorry I was cut halfway through. This will stop. Okay. So yes, I think this is better. So welcome, everyone. When Steve was kind enough to offer me to write in that book, and I was thinking, okay, what can I contribute into this topic, and I was thinking about that, and I think what I managed to see was I would say oops, let me do this again, at least two themes that are important and that come across when we're talking about Jewish migration, but also migration in general. And I think one of the themes, and they're related, somewhat related. One of the themes is that, and that's already several scholars have explored, immigrants are not a blank slate, they're not a blank page. When they come to America, they already have a set of expectations. And many times, contrary to the narrative of linear acculturation, which is kind of commonsensical, and it's very, very conventional, even in the way people write about that. Contrary to that, you have a certain process of idealization of America prior to immigration, and then growing disillusionment once you get there. And I think that's a very important facet that I deal with in my article. The second theme, which is related, and I'm going to talk more about that today, is that certain immigrant groups already have connections in the old world, and they have certain patterns, social, cultural, economic patterns in the old world. And when they come to America, they both replicate and modify those connections, that interrelations. There is a study by Eva Moravska, a classical study of the town of Jonestown, Pennsylvania, Insecure Prosperity, when she took a look at Jews from Eastern Europe and other nationalities, Poles, Slovaks, Bohemians, Hungarians, and so on, and how they both replicated and changed and modified their relationship. And there is a quote by Israel Kopolov. I apologize for this bad, the bad quality of this picture. That's the best I could find. That when he went to America, he went through Berlin, and then he said, "Oh my God, the Germans are they're so beautiful, they're so Europeanized in comparison to my shtetl." But then, of course, when he brushes against a corpulent German who calls him a goddamn Jew, he begs the forgiveness of Bobrois, of his shtetl. So I thought that the images or the way Eastern European Jews view Germans would give me a nice foothold, a nice case study to examine this replication and modification of interethnic relations. And I think it's important to keep in mind that when we're talking about German culture and Eastern European Jews, as opposed to German Jews, as opposed to Jews who lived in Germany proper or the German lands, for 1871, there is no unified Germany. We need to keep in mind a couple of factors. There is the German origin of the Haskalah, of the Jewish Enlightenment, which is very prestigious. There is the proximity of Yiddish, the Yiddish language, to German, which makes the German language kind of a gateway to European culture for Yiddish-speaking Jews. And this is especially important in Galicia, which is part of the Habsburg Empire. So you have a multi-ethnic, multinational region with an Austrian government, and German is the language of the government and its higher status, but also in the Russian Empire, which of course have a small German ethnic minority, but also the government, the Tsarist government, is seeking to Europeanize or acculturate Jews via the German route. And there is a quote here of Yosef Rolnik, who was a Yiddish poet, and when he got to Libau, today Liapa in Latvia, but then Libau was in the Russian Empire, and it had a large German population, that town, and he walks into a German bookstore, he looks at it from the outside, he says, "I felt that I'm almost in Germany, I'm in Europe," meaning he wasn't in Europe beforehand. German culture is the gateway to European culture. And I think it also has to do, this esteem of German culture in East European Jewish society has to do with the fact that the surrounding nations, usually Slavic nations, usually peasant nations, did not have so much of an appeal to Jews, to modernizing Jews especially, and German culture had. So you have many reasons why German culture had this particular place in East European Jewish society. And it's not only an external influence. From a certain point in time, by the second quarter of the 19th century, definitely afterward, it becomes part and parcel of Jewish society. People speak about Deutschen, they mean Maskilim, people who are proponents of modernization, of the Haskalah, but not just Jewish enlightenment in an abstract way, but almost any new custom or social phenomenon is called Deutsch, called German. And then there is the new type, Jews without a beard, without the side locks, the payas, wearing a short jacket rather than those old kaftans that you can see here on the right-hand side of traditional Jewish men, and in this case, men. And Max Lilienthal, who would later become a reform rabbi in Cincinnati, in 1840, as a young man, the Russian government brings him to Russia, and she tries to have him supervise the many Jewish schools, government schools that would try to Europeanize, to Westernize Jewish kids, and the Orthodox don't like him, and after 4 years he leaves. But this idea of the Deutsch, it becomes already an internal character within Jewish society, not just an external influence. And with carrying with it the prestige that sometimes even the Orthodox opponents of them have to admit that they are holding a very elevated culture. And you can see it in when you look at the memoir literature, you can see a lot of that. Those are only two examples. Shmaryahu Levin, who would become a very famous, very influential Zionist leader, but also a popular Yiddish speaker in the New World in America. He wrote in his memoirs, "I admire the German drive for education and knowledge. I admired even more the German language and literature with which I became more familiarized than Russian, unquote. And he grew up in an area which is today Belarus, grew up within the Russian Empire. And you can see this appreciation. Chaim Zhitlovsky, a very famous Yiddishist and diaspora nationalist and philosopher who would become influential in America, but was already influential in Russia among revolutionary circles. And he wrote about growing up in Vitebsk, in the Pale of Settlement, and how his dad, but not just his father, many people around him really admired German culture. The German nature had made a tremendous impression on him. And Abe Kahan, the towering figure in Jewish socialism, said, the difference between, when he went to Germany, the difference between a modern country and Russia. So Germany and German culture are becoming, they're symbols of modernity, they're symbols of change. And I think you can see that in the memoir literature many times. And of course, like many things, as the saying, familiarity breeds contempt, perhaps. But once those East European Jews start to brush against Germans, once they start seeing the downsides of German culture and German society and Austrian society, and I should say maybe Habsburg even more than the German Empire, because you have a lot of commercial ties between Tsarist Russia and Habsburg Empire. And once by the 1870s, 1880s, there is the rise of pseudoscientific racial anti-Semitism, Germany and Austria, and that blemishes the images of Germans and Austrians. Here you can have a few pictures. The ones above, those are postcards that people used to buy in the Habsburg Empire to send back home. And it portrayed the Jewish guest in those spa towns, in those resorts, in a very offensive way. You can see that the females are not exactly females, the males are not exactly males. Nur nicht ängstlich, just don't be afraid. They're unathletic, you can call them the unathletic department. They're kind of gross. You can see the lower cartoon from 1899 Munich, when one of the women says to the other one, "Take another piece of cake, Mrs. Cohen. Thank you, I've already had one. Even though you already had two, you may take another one." So they're gross on a physical level, on a mental level, and so on. And once those anti-Semitic images and ideas and political forces are starting to take hold, that indeed creates a reality check for the images of German and German culture among East European Jews. Another important thing is that once they go to America, most of the Jews from Eastern Europe, Tsarist Russia, Habsburg Galicia, and Romania have to pass through Germany. After 1871, there is already a unified Germany, to ports, whether in Bremen or Hamburg, or even if they go further west to Antwerp or Amsterdam, and later England, and they have to pass through Germany. And when you see the descriptions of how they were treated, and you can see that's another way of when they are brushing against Germans to be demystify their image. Mary Antin, who published in 1912 a very influential book, The Promised Land, which celebrated America, described how was it to pass via Germany. White-clad Germans shouting commands, always accompanied with schnell, schnell, quickly, and the confused passengers obeying all orders like meek children, strange-looking people driving us about like dumb animals. And that treatment was not unusual, and her impressions really repeat themselves in dozens or even hundreds of memoirs and some of the literature. And some people who write later, her book came out in 1912, books that were published later, especially after World War II, during or after World War II, already are throwing back World War II and the Holocaust back to that period. Meir Weisgall, who would become one of the leaders of American Zionism, he recalled the grim efficiency of the Germans, their treatment of us as cattle, and he saw it as a rehearsal for the Holocaust. And it's important to note that already letters of people who did the voyage and are writing back home, already warning would-be immigrants you know what, maybe you should not take the Norddeutscher Lloyd in Bremen because you're going to be mistreated on board. And there is the story that I relate in my article of a letter that was published in the Jüdischer Immigrant, which a society that helped Jews immigrate out of Tsarist Russia. And they complained about how the German crew treated them on board. And that when a Jewish passenger in the dining hall wanted a clean glass, one of the waiters said, "Warum wollen Sie ein rein Glas, wenn von Ihnen stinkt doch Jude? Why do you need a clean glass when you stink, Jew?" And this is not a little bit colloquial German because that's the way it appeared in that Yiddish language newspaper. So you already have the brushing against Germans and the travel via Germany, of course, has a lot to do with that disillusionment. Now, once in America, it's very important to note that the German community, German-American community, really provided a paradigm for the recently arrived immigrants from Eastern Europe, because with their fraternal orders, with their lodges, with their labor unions, with their ethnic press, all of those were very important as a model for the immigrants, and they looked up to them. That was especially important for immigrants who were socialists or anarchists. For them, they really revered what was created by German Americans. And again, the German language sometimes is before English is very accessible to them. You can see here Arbeiter Ring, the Workmen's Circle, and also the United Hebrew Trades, those umbrella organizations that were modeled after German American labor organization, fraternal organization, labor union. Maurice Hilkowitz, originally Hilkowitz, who was born and raised in Riga and therefore was bilingual, German and Russian. He also knew Yiddish, of course, but that was for him maybe perhaps not as important, would become one of the leaders of the Socialist Party in America. And he writes, immediately when he came to America, when he was still Hilkowitz, before he anglicized that to Hilkowitz, that German workers, he meant German American, are much more intelligent than American workers. To translate that, intelligent meaning much more politically aware, much more politically savvy. So there is definitely still putting German culture and Germans on a pedestal still continues in the new land. The thing is that the very same dynamics that happened in Europe repeats itself in the United States. And the images of German become much more ambivalent once they brush against East European Jews. So you have in Little Germany, which really borders the Lower East Side, first of all, there is a German flight, you might call it, when they don't want Jews to move into those areas, but also once there are direct contacts between those two populations, more and more immigrants, and they write that already in the Yiddish newspapers, but also in their memoirs, that they see a lot of anti-Jewish acrimony and hatred. Those are just a couple of examples. The labor organizer Avrom Pinchas Unger, he goes in the early 1900s, and he wants to rent an apartment on First Avenue in downtown Manhattan, and the German landlord refused to rent him the apartment because Jews are schlampig und schmutzig. You know, they're messy and dirty. And Sam Karasik, another immigrant who comes to Baltimore, on my first day on the job, he says he looks at those pot-belly Germans. He says, "I think I'm in Bremen, not in Baltimore." And then he hears the phrase "goddamn Jew" already on his first day on the job. And finally, something like the Great War, World War I, exemplifies, it's kind of a microcosm to look at that dynamic of how you both replicate and modify those relations. When the war breaks out in 1914, the US is still out until April 1917. But when World War I breaks out in August 1914, most American Jews of East European origin are pro-German and definitely pro-Austrian. People who came from Hungary or Galicia are pro-Austrian because the Franz Joseph and the Habsburg Empire was good to them. Those from Tsarist Russia see all the atrocities that the Tsarist military is committing, and they immediately would like to support their enemies. You have a picture here of the German army marching through Nowy Sącz, Neusendeck and Zendeck in German, in Poland, and Jews welcome them because they're the liberators in many ways from the tyrannical Russians. And Abe Kahan, that I mentioned before, really one of the towering figures in the Jewish labor movement, says all civilized people sympathize with Germany. Now, of course, by 1917, once the US enters the war, and you can see here the poster, destroy this mad brute, enlist. Once the US enters the war, the dynamic changes, and then people start speaking about German cruelty and how they mess things on the Eastern Front, and they start switching sides. So I think it's very important to conclude. I think it's a very important dynamic that if you zoom out and you look at other immigrant groups in terms of their old world relationship and how that transferred to the new world. And also, I would say, how they imagine America, because some national groups, of course, have never met one another before they come to the United States. Right now, I'm working on a book-length study of the images of Black people in Yiddish culture. But it's not just East European Jews, for example, other nationalities who come to America and find new nationalities. So their Americanization is always a triangulation of being absorbed in the host country while negotiating the relationship with other national groups, with other immigrant groups, or ethnic and racial groups, some of which they knew in the old world, some of them they did not. And all of that create very complex dynamics. And I hope that I managed to convey some of it today. So thank you very much. And I'm looking forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Gil, for a very complex and insightful argument. And we turn next to Kirsten Fermaglich to talk about our own local community. It's the community that we've made, Jewish migration to East Lansing, Michigan, in the post-war era. And then please write your Q&A for Kirsten's talk or all the talks so we can have a discussion afterwards. Thanks.
Hi, well, thank you so much. I have so many people. I apologize. I'm going to be thanking a lot of people before I start talking. So first, I would like to thank the entire Sterling Institute, especially its director, Yael Aronoff, and Ariana Mansell and Michal Aydin for their work in publicizing and helping to prepare today's presentation, which I've already found fascinating. Thank you so much to Gil and to Laura. I found a lot of things that I think are actually echoing in my work, although it's so very different from yours. And particular thanks to Steven Gold, who invited me to write something for this book quite some time ago. And it was a wonderful motivation for me to start a project that I had in my head, but had not really gotten a chance to do work on. So I'm so thrilled to be able to be a part of this book, which I find is fascinating and a really valuable contribution, and to be included in this work is really exciting for me. I have to give particular thanks. I've been scrolling the participants. I have to give particular thanks to all the people who spoke to me for my research. I spoke to a good number of people who gave me a great deal of their time and energy, and I'm so grateful to them for speaking with me. And I'm pleased to see a good number of them here, and I hope that I've done you justice, and feel free to tell me if I haven't. And I also see several people who are on my list of people that I needed to talk to, but was not able to contact before this came out. I apologize deeply and would really love to talk to you. There was a little bit of rush and sort of COVID related stuff that made me sort of have to rush this work before I might have been comfortable. And so I welcome any comments, constructive criticism that you have, and I would love to speak with you soon in the future, especially as the semester ends and I can get back to research. And thank you so much for being here. I also want to thank another person in the audience, Chantal Tetreau, who is in the anthropology department and helped me do all of these interviews that I did. It was wonderful to work with her, and I'm thrilled she can be here. I also want to thank our undergraduate assistant, Leah Welch, who is not here, and the Provost Undergraduate Research Initiative offered money for Leah to help us do our research. And so I'm really grateful to both Chantal and Leah for their help. And then finally, I would like to thank just everyone for being here on this gorgeous day. Thank you for continuing to sit in front of your screens a little longer, and a special shout out to my students who actually came. So thank you so much, all of you, for being here. And then before I get started, I just want to sort of make clear, as I already sort of indicated, this is the beginning of what I hope will be a longer book-length study on academic Jewish migration in the post-World War II era. So this is like the very, very beginning of this project. So I really look forward to everyone's constructive criticism and help as I sort of think through the project. Okay, so, and also I do need to say that I'm not going to be, I don't have any fancy graphics because of the early nature of this. I didn't ask people for pictures, so you're just going to be watching me read. In 1967, David and Beverly Weiner and their 2 daughters left their grad student housing community in Syracuse, New York, and arrived in East Lansing, Michigan, ready for David to start his new job as an assistant professor in the American Thought and Language program at Michigan State University. David was born in Philadelphia, grew up in a Jewish neighborhood there, and his entire tight-knit family had gone to school in the Philadelphia area. His mother was deeply upset with his decision to take a job halfway across the country. But at least one fellow graduate of Syracuse assured him that he wouldn't stay long at MSU. He could stay a few years and then move elsewhere. David and Bev, however, remained in East Lansing for over 50 years, in part with the help of the community that they had helped to create, a group of young Jewish families who had almost all come to East Lansing to work at MSU. They celebrated Jewish holidays together, created new rituals, established a Hebrew school for their children, and then in 1970 established an innovative lay-led synagogue, Kehillat Israel. With a tiny Jewish population and only one really significant Jewish institution in mid-Michigan before the late 1960s, young Jewish academic families like the Weiners forged their own meaningful and lasting Jewish community. The Weiners' story in East Lansing is part of a larger pattern of the post-World War II era that has rarely been studied or even acknowledged by historians. As higher education boomed and restrictions on Jews in academia lifted, the years after World War II saw thousands of young Jews from Jewish neighborhoods in big cities going to graduate school and then finding jobs in higher education in college towns and small cities throughout the country. Few scholars have identified this movement as a significant wave of internal migration within the United States, although many of these migrants' experiences and decisions echo those of other internal migration waves that historians like Hasia Diner, Shari Rabin, Lila Corwin Berman, and Deborah Dash Moore have described for Jews. Community leaders in the 1960s and 1970s worried that the move into academia would separate young, ambitious, intellectual Jews from the Jewish community, even calling them runaway Jewish intellectuals. But no historians have identified or addressed this anxiety or the actual experiences of these Jews after they moved. Exploring the migration of these young Jews and their families allows us to think differently about Jewish creativity, adaptability, and regional variety, in the United States. And although my research grounded in 28 oral histories and some documents, some synagogue documents, is only in its beginning stages, it suggests that the experience of migration to a college town with few Jews, like East Lansing, during an era of religious experimentation and educational boom, actually intensified and made more meaningful the Jewish identities of many Jewish academic migrants. Excuse me. Most of the Jews who moved to East Lansing in the 1960s and 1970s grew up in heavily Jewish neighborhoods in cities like New York, Los Angeles, and Chicago. Paul Menschik remembered of growing up in Crown Heights, Brooklyn. I didn't really know a white Christian until I went to college. It was very much cloistered. A number of migrants remembered streets studded with synagogues and shuls, shopping districts laden with Jewish delis and kosher markets, and packs of neighborhood kids, most of them Jewish, playing on the streets. Some Jewish migrants made close friendships through their synagogues or youth groups, which were deeply embedded in the fabric of their neighborhoods and family lives. Most grew up with grandparents, aunts, uncles, and cousins living in the same neighborhood or nearby. Several spent their leisure time participating in large family get-togethers regularly. And it was Jewish institutions, from Orthodox shuls around the block, to B'nai B'rith youth organizations, to Boy Scout troops, to kosher butchers, that formed the backdrops for these friendships and relationships. Migrants remembered hearing Orthodox cantors sing from open synagogue windows down the street and attending conservative Saturday morning services so they could meet up with their friends and go to a movie in the afternoon. Jewish institutions were part of the backdrop of their childhoods, so much so that many took being Jewish for granted. never went to Shabbat services as children, and avoided youth groups. Lisa Fine noted, in my view, Jewishness was background noise because it was so ubiquitous. You didn't pay attention to it. Jewish institutions, friends, and family in Jewish neighborhoods enabled many Jews who would eventually migrate to East Lansing to develop Jewish identities as children that had nothing to do with the practice of the religion itself. These Jewish identities faced significant culture shock when men and women found themselves moving for jobs at Michigan State University. Most of the men and women who came to East Lansing did have previous experience in the Midwest, having grown up in cities like Chicago or Cleveland, or attended school at the universities of Michigan or Wisconsin. But East Lansing was different. Part of the metropolitan area of Lansing, capital of Michigan, Lansing's population boomed in the years after World War II, in part because of the growth of MSU. But nonetheless, compared with the cities from which most of these men and women hailed, the capital area was tiny. In 1970, the combined population of East Lansing and Lansing was less than 180,000. And beyond its small size, Lansing had little diversity. As we know from the work of Lisa Fine, Ari Olds, the auto manufacturer in Lansing, had historically hired its workers from surrounding white rural areas rather than recruiting Blacks or immigrants in order to preserve the homogeneity of its workforce. Jews were a tiny minority in this overwhelmingly Christian city. And perhaps surprisingly, the presence of Michigan State University did little to broaden ethnic diversity. Unlike the University of Michigan, which had historically attracted a Jewish population and encouraged a cosmopolitan environment, Michigan State's origins as an agricultural college, a MSU, shaped the culture of East Lansing. Many migrants admitted to feeling alienated by the lack of diversity, and particularly the lack of a Jewish community when they got their jobs and first arrived in Lansing. Don Kaufman remembered the homogeneity here, the lack of diversity, the fact that even though this was a college town, there weren't any places to eat. I mean, it was a white bread city and no Jews. It was kind of a shock. Despite those concerns, because they had backgrounds where Jewishness was simply a backdrop, most migrants did not seek out Jewish life at the beginning of their years in East Lansing. And indeed, there was little Jewish communal life to seek out. There was only one synagogue in town, Shrei Zedek, a far cry from the multiple synagogues, shops, and restaurants with which most men and women had grown up. And many academics and their families did not find Shrei Zedek a welcoming environment at the time, even though it held both reform and conservative services. Instead, they viewed Shrei Zedek as the province of the wealthy business people of the community. Shrei Zedek at that time was very snooty, Art Siegel remembered. They looked down on the academics. Moreover, Shrei Zedek was traditional in its gender roles. Women could not lead services, read from the Torah, or make aliyah, go up to the bima. Shrei Zedek was a space in which women served coffee and tea, Arthur Elstein noted. They ran the kitchen. Shrei Zedek was not a space where women stood up and said, "This is what I think." Perhaps most significant for migrants, however, was an issue that scholars have identified as central to synagogue participation in the United States: decorum. Elements like room arrangements, prayer tunes, and their style of praying mattered more for young migrants than issues of denomination or theology. I wasn't going to join a regular synagogue, not me, Toba Kaplowitz laughed. I also felt the very limitations of expectations and the traditional stuff, the role of women. There were all sorts of issues. My mindset was no traditional shul. I'm not even going to give it a chance. These cultural discomforts with the only significant Jewish institution in East Lansing had lasting and perhaps surprising impact. These men and women who had been content to let Jewishness be only a silent backdrop to their lives, wound up constructing several vibrant Jewish institutions of their own in mid-Michigan in the 1960s and 1970s. By 1968, about a half dozen migrant families had established Rishon, a Hebrew school where Jews could learn the letters and learn about the holidays. The founders were young Jewish families who were not interested in becoming members of the synagogue, but had kind of a secular humanist approach to Judaism and wanted to have a Jewish community. And that's all a quote from David Weiner. While the younger children learned inside the Hillel house, their parents socialized on the porch outside. We would all bring our New York Times and our coffee and bagels, and we would sit around and talk, David Weiner remembered fondly. Soon members of Rishon began to celebrate the holidays together at one another's homes, creating services and inventing new rituals for Sukkot, Purim, and especially Passover. Then in 1970, some members of Rishon who sought a more sophisticated religious education for their children and a deeper religious experience for themselves, joined with dissatisfied academic Sharei Zedek congregants to establish a new congregation, Kehilat Israel, or KI. In purposeful contrast with Sharei Zedek, Kehilat Israel was egalitarian. KI's first documents put gender equality at the center of the congregation's rebellious self-definition. Women will be called to the Torah and will be counted for a minyan, the prospectus for a new Jewish congregation read. And the synagogue's first bylaws spelled out membership in egalitarian terms. The unit of membership shall be either the individual or the family, both men and women, sharing alike the same rights, privileges, and obligations of membership. The new congregation also purposely rejected the emphasis on wealth at Sharei Zedek, eliminating required dues payments and keeping all donations anonymous. Perhaps most significantly, Kehilat Israel was also self-consciously experimental and participatory, focused on education, community, and self-expression. The overriding goal, the bylaws explained, is an atmosphere in which individuals may explore and develop more meaningful means of Jewish expression together. In its founding documents, KI congregants reflected the countercultural Jewish moment, which was emerging throughout the country. Independent minyanim and havarot were transforming American Judaism during this era, as young Jews sought to construct institutions that reflected their own politics and aesthetics. KI's lack of finances, as well as its emphasis on radical self-expression and its determined and educated congregation, resulted in a lay-led congregation for years, no rabbi. Some academic migrants who had gone to Camp Ramah or Orthodox shuls as children were capable of leading services, and they trained others to do the same. For the academic migrants of KI, the lay-led nature of the congregation, the emphasis on personal participation and experimentation, and the absence of a rabbi made their religious experiences far more intense and even enjoyable. It was such a thrill to have KI, where we asked questions, Art Siegel remembered. We were without a rabbi for 18 years. That was terrific. That was more fun. While these sentiments were common to young countercultural Jews in cities like Los Angeles and Boston during this era, the desire for self-expression and experimentation functioned differently in East Lansing. It allowed academics to build Jewish identity, family, and community in a mostly non-Jewish environment, far from their families. When I think about growing up in Chicago, Rich Block explained, Jewish community was always there, but it's not something I did. This, I feel that I had a little piece of creating. Here, everybody has a little piece of creating it. Whatever it is, it's because we've made it. For many secular urban Jews, it wasn't even their own Jewish identities that were most important. It was those of their children. Academic migrants in the 1960s had Jewish identities formed by the institutions, extended families, neighbors, and friends of their childhood Jewish neighborhoods. But their own children raised in East Lansing would not experience any element of their parents' Jewish childhoods. Indeed, they would probably know very few Jews or experience Jewish life at all in East Lansing without organized education, which migrants felt they had to construct on their own. Many academic migrants discussed their decisions to join KI as a product of this realization. Part of who I was always Jewish, Harry Perlstadt said. It's not that I was terribly religious, but I knew I was Jewish. It was something that was a part of me, and I wanted it to be part of my children. Jewish upward mobility in the years after World War II was frequently premised on geographic mobility, but not only to the suburbs or the Sun Belt, as other historians have written about, also to college towns like East Lansing, Michigan. Once in those college towns, many young Jewish academics and their families participated in the Jewish countercultural movement that was reshaping American Judaism in the 1960s and 1970s. But that movement took on very different meaning for men and women hundreds of miles from their homes, families, and established Jewish communities. They not only distinguished themselves from more established Jews in decorum and politics, but they created a Jewish community, family, and identity in unfamiliar spaces far from home. The Jewish lives they made for themselves and the institutions they built suggest that there is greater richness, diversity, and texture in American Jewish history than has previously been considered. Thanks very much for your time.
Thank you for a wonderful, wonderful panel. I saw 2 questions in the Q&A, and I'll add mine as well to get us started. And please continue to write questions as we talk in the Q&A so that we can have a robust discussion. There are 2 questions for Gil that were in the Q&A. One from Thomas Kovacs asking you to elaborate on the German Jews' views of Eastern European Jews, and a second by Farial Farhadi Gil, can you talk about Jews originating from Iran and Turkey? So I want us to get started with those two questions from Gil, and then I want to pose a question to maybe all the panelists while we're waiting for more questions. And certainly all of you really spoke to the diversity of the Jewish experience, the diversity in terms of strength of identity, depending on when you come and whether you're first generation or second generation or where you are, the innovations that you make in identity as a migrant. And some of you spoke, as Gil did, also to relations among Jews, right? I don't know if you might elaborate on whether any of these kind of newer innovations that also Kirsten spoke of last in terms of our local community, how you might relate that to the 2013 kind of Pew statistics as measures of identity that Laura spoke of as well, right? I mean, are those, should we be altering, adapting, modifying those measures of identity? I guess is one question that I had coming out as you all were speaking. And to what extent might be identity kind of more shaped by kind of an environment in which Jews are a real minority or face greater degrees of anti-Semitism, as on one hand, Kirsten spoke about, on the other hand, Gil spoke about, and kind of you think, oh, people might worry, would it diminish your Jewish identity to live in a place like East Lansing? But on the other hand, it's almost, you know, being such a small minority can act to strengthen that identity, right, in certain respects, or facing an environment of anti-Semitism like Gil spoke about can strengthen it, and you can have it strengthened in a bigger, stronger Jewish community, right? So that also speaks to the diversity. Anyway, I just was, I'm being too long-winded, but those are questions that arose in terms of comparing and contrasting and having you guys elaborate on whether it modifies kind of how we measure identity and how it is shaped through these Pew statistics. But Gil, you go first with Eastern European, how do German Jews view East European Jews, and what about Jews originating from Iran and Turkey, as you all think about the other question as well?
Thank you so much for those comments, Yael, and thank you so much for the people in the audience for those questions. I think, let me start, German Jews and Eastern European Jews, you have two schools of historiography about that. There was the positive school that said, yeah, the two communities did not like one another. It is well known that in the 1880s, several German Jewish representatives went to Congress and tried to block the Eastern European Jews from coming to America. A very little known fact that even Emma Lazarus, you know, the new Colossus, give me you're tired, you're poor, as long as they're not Jewish. Even she went in 1882 to Ward's Island and she talked in social Darwinistic terms about stop them, because they might overwhelm the United States, send them to Zion, send them somewhere else. So the first school of historiography said, yeah, there were tensions, but they built bridges, and by the time of World War I and afterward, they amalgamated as a community. There are several historians who have written more critically about that and said those fissures would continue for many years later. In terms of, for example, how the American Jewish Committee would remain an exclusive organization and would try to suppress the American Jewish Congress movement that was going on in World War I. And I can add more about that, but I want to go to the second question. You had the time period that I'm covering, as opposed to today, had very few Jews from Persia, or from Iran. As for the Ottoman Empire, you had Sephardi Jews, people who came from Aleppo, from Turkey Minor, Asia Minor, excuse me, as it was called then, came from the Ottoman Empire to New York. Their numbers were not large. Many of them spoke Judeo-Spanish, or Ladino if you like. And it's very interesting that even though you might think that they, for example, Italian immigrants, and they can kind of even understand one another, because Judeo-Spanish is medieval Spanish, but with many words in Italian, for example, that they can maybe get along, but that was not the case. So their numbers were small in comparison to East European Jews, talking about 30 or 40,000 of them. So that's what I had to say about that. What Yael asked, it's a very big one. I would say some sociologists speak in terms of ethnicization, meaning how an immigrant group that didn't have necessarily that kind of strong identity, once it comes to America and then it either adversity or other external influences actually makes it glue better again. Eastern European Jews, for example, in the old world did not necessarily see themselves as one unit. You have Litvaks, you have Galicianos, you have all of those. All of a sudden, when they meet established Jews, German Jews and others, and they meet anti-Semitism, they become East European Jews. So we need to think of what ways those identities, I don't want to use the word imagined or invented because there is a source of, to begin with, of identity, but we need to think of how America kind of influenced the creation and maintenance of certain ethnic identities that did not exist in the old world and kind of emerged in America.
Would anyone else like to respond to the kind of my long-winded, big question?
I'll respond a little bit. Yeah, I mean, I think that clearly the focus of my work was very much, and sort of the kind of the operating drive of it was certainly to sort of think about the ways that a smaller being a minority actually in some ways kind of intensified Jewish communities, certainly for the people that I studied. But it's also true that in general, and I've done other, secular Jews have been an interest of mine. And it's certainly true that not everyone, sort of expressed Jewishness in this way or chose to participate in Kehillat Israel. And it is possible that, it didn't, that it might have had other effects, and I definitely want to look more into that. I think it's a really interesting question. But I was very struck by the ways that so many people for whom Jewishness was not important actually turned to it. In part out of some of the things that that Laura spoke about earlier in her panel, and then also I think out of, for me, what I was very struck by was the need for sort of childhood. It was sort of a memory of childhood, of people's own childhoods, and a desire to kind of create something, not the same thing, but to create something for their children. I'm really interested in sort of thinking about the ways this is about family construction and identity as well. But I'm struck by that. But I definitely need to attend to the other possibilities. And I do want to sort of comment, I know that your point about anti-Semitism was mostly directed at Gil, right? And sort of thinking about both of our works together. But I will say that I certainly asked people about anti-Semitism, and not much, right? It was actually not that much. It depended on how people felt. But I didn't, and if anyone heard anything, it was mostly sort of silence about Jews or forgetting about Jews and Jewish holidays for their children, again, in their schools, more than any other kinds of active efforts, which I wasn't sure what to expect, but definitely that wasn't one of the motivating factors I didn't find. So, but it's interesting, and definitely, I think I would want to explore it more.
So I've thought a lot about this question in large part because this is, this study, but sort of other work that I've done has dealt with identity, and I put up the factors that I used, and in large part I looked at sort of, first of all, the things that correlated with one another. Otherwise, it wouldn't. There were some things that I left out, but I think the Pew study is an American study. So in many ways, and there's a new study coming out, and they're asking new questions, and or they've asked new questions rather. So hopefully some of these measures will change. But I think this idea of becoming one larger sub-ethnic group or one larger ethnic group and subsuming different sub-ethnic groups is sort of what happens to Jews, right? This has been part of the migration process, and we see it sort of, are Israeli Jews all the same? Absolutely not, right? In Israel, they would consider themselves different parts of different sub-ethnic groups within Israel. We see that among Latin American Jews. Mexican Jews, Argentine Jews, Venezuelan Jews, sure, they share some things in common. And same with Jews from the former Soviet Union. There's and then they come here, and it's and you use the word imagine, and I would say it's actually created, right? Like you create an avenue for identity across other groups with what you have. And this might be a right. It might be the fact that maybe you remember your grandmother lighting candles on Shabbat, and now you do too, and therefore that you're Jewish. And look, now you do something that's similar, and now you're creating a ritual that has existed, but now that you're participating in a ritual that now brings you together. So I think that that's over time we've seen what's happened as you know, we've seen Eastern European Jews become Eastern European Jews and then sort of just become American Jews. And that's part of the assimilation process, and identity shifts across across different factors that make up identity.
Thanks very much. I have some ideas about this too that are consistent with many of your comments and presentations. One of the things that's been mentioned in many cases is Chabad, and I think they're very appealing to a whole variety, all the different Jewish immigrant groups that I've been involved with. And they even mix up ethnicity so that it's a traditional Yiddish-speaking Eastern European group, that there might be Yemeni Chabad rabbis involved in it. But they're not this kind of modern American liberal Jewishness that immigrants might not relate to, but and they tend to be experts in the language and other cultural aspects of whoever the communities are. So they know Spanish, they know Farsi, they know Hebrew, these other kinds of things. And also, even though they are very religious, they're also very tolerant in terms of not putting down constituencies for not knowing. I mean, this isn't an immigrant case, but the Chabad would go to Dead concerts and appeal to young Jewish American hippie kids. So I think they have an inclusiveness and non-judgmentalness, while at the same time speaking of some kind of authentic Judaism without perhaps the super intellectual or liberal aspects that immigrants might find unusual. I think another kind of thing is that sometimes Jewish immigrants become, as has been suggested, part of communities for more pragmatic reasons. I mean, I did work with both Israelis and Russian-speaking Jews, and they would become involved in American Jewish organizations mostly for their kids' socialization. They weren't really that happy with them, and sometimes even the Russian-speaking Jews would describe that their kids could get into a scholarship to a Jewish high school, and they would have to evaluate that. They want their kids to go to a more academically prestigious, not secular school, or take advantage of some of the benefits of a Jewish school. Another pattern, I think actually Laura has discussed this as well as others. Some of the Jewish communities have ethnic and social bonds with non-Jewish members of their same community. I think that Latino Jews, Iranian Jews, they might be involved in social and cultural activities with members of their co-ethnic community who aren't Jewish, because they share language and culture and foods and practices and so forth. And then finally, there's kind of interesting dimensions on the other side that talk about some of the things that Gil mentioned, that as well as separating from groups perhaps that they knew pre-migration, there's also some cases of unity there, that even in the early 20th century, there's discussion about how Catholic Polish immigrants to Chicago preferred to shop from the Jewish Polish shop owners that they were familiar with prior to migration, and the Catholic middle class shop owners tried to develop campaigns to discourage fellow Poles from dealing with these Jewish stores, but they were comfortable with that, with them and their practices from prior migration. So there's a lot of different dimensions of involvement and different directions that people will go into. Some maybe new, some of the pan-ethnic things might be a new pattern that didn't occur very much in earlier periods.
Interesting. So I see a comment and question that kind of relate to Gil's talk, and then a question for Laura Limonic. So there was a comment by Annette Wedenschenk that when her mom lived in Poland and her grandfather was a Chazan through World War I, she often recalled how happy the Jewish community was with German occupation, and they could marginally communicate, were admired for their culture, and were deeply associated for cleaning up the town. When the US entered the war, the community was devastated because, as she said, we knew this was the beginning of the end for the Germans, and the Russians would be back. They were horrible. So that kind of speaks to kind of the what Gil was talking, the admiration, initial admiration that Gil was talking about. And then there's a question for you, Gil, a quick request if you would consider elaborating on your statement that once the US entered the war in 1917, the Mainzer or alliance were switching in Germany. How did this change in reality manifest itself? My grandfather and great uncles were on the Western Front in German uniform. And how did the 1917 impact these Jews who were in the trenches? So that's for you, Gil. Then I'll read the next one for you, Laura, after that. And please continue to post your questions.
Thank you, Oded. If I'm not mistaken, your question referred to Jews in Germany who indeed remained very, very much patriotic despite the Judenzel, the idea that Jews are not serving in the military, that some German nationalists tried to kind of float in 1915, 1916. They remained very much German patriots. And so if I understand your question correctly, you refer to Germany proper. In the United States, what happens is that the first Russian Revolution, March 1917, and definitely, I mean, the Bolshevik one was accepted in much more mixed feelings. The first one, it kind of frees East European Jews from their, pro-German attitude, because now Russia turned into, quote unquote, a democracy that does not persecute its Jewish minority, so they can they can identify with the Entente, with the Allies, and then you see within really 6-7 months, even the socialists and other radicals that were pro, they said the U.S. should be neutral or whatever. Then after the Brest-Litovsk agreement between what would already the Soviet Union and Imperial Germany, they say, we have to help the Entente. Before I forget, because I tend to forget, Kirsten gave a wonderful paper which really reminds me of Deborah Dash Moore's To the Golden Cities. And I think you need to kind of, and I'm the only one from the Sun Belt here, I guess, you'll need to think really in terms of comparison, because she makes, for example, the case for how different climate would change Jewish communities in Florida, and how, for example, Florida would get people from New York, but LA will get it from Chicago and the upper Midwest. So how would someone coming from New Jersey or New York to East Lansing, okay, it's not that tropical. So you need, it's a much smaller case, but how the Zionist movement, societies, women's societies, auxiliary societies, all sorts of things. But it's really fascinating. So sorry for hogging the.
I don't know if I should respond to that or if Laura should.
Sure, go ahead first, Kirsten.
Yeah. Just really quickly, in the longer piece, and then I've been really engaging with that. To me, what's very interesting is the way that by not having a warmer climate, someplace like East Lansing does not attract chain migration. It doesn't attract, much of what she describes as sort of this like boom and lots of people coming and, handsome, charismatic rabbis showing up, to sort of create a congregation in their own image. And that does not happen here, right? So I think in some ways, like the lack of climate is interesting, right? There's nothing drawing people here but the university, right? But the service industry. And so it leads to this very sort of small enclosed kind of thing rather than the more expansive kind of building. But I am very interested in that. And I'm actually curious to look at, I hadn't thought about it till you said it, but I'm kind of curious to look at maybe college towns in nicer, warmer places. I hadn't really thought about that as like something that might attract more family to come, right? That might actually you might be able to sort of bring more people here and sort of create more of a community, sort of recreate more of your community than I think happened here. So it's a really well taken point. Thank you.
So the question for Laura from Jihan Mohammed is, thank you for the great presentation. Does the literature differentiate between religion and religiosity in the sense that does practicing rituals, are they a good indicator for how religious a person is? For example, a person may indicate high frequency of praying and attending services at the synagogue. However, the level of devotion during the ritual could be low. This concern is raised by some Middle Eastern psychologists and education scholars who look at the impact of religiosity on various other variables. I wonder if similar concern are raised in the literature you reviewed.
So I read that question and I copied it to think about it later, in large part because I don't have a good answer. Probably because I don't want to say that I'm not interested in how religious somebody is, but I'm thinking of religiosity as an indicator of identity. And that's more interesting to me in terms of how a Jewish identity is constructed, rather than how religious if a person's, what makes a person a good Jew, for example. Because it's a very, very, very interesting question, and I've been thinking a little bit more about it now with this study on Chabad. So I'm very glad that Steve, you brought Chabad up, because I think in some ways it's that Chabad is not, when we think about immigrants, not just here in the United States, but sort of wandering Jews across the globe, it's the Chabad centers and the Chabad houses that are sort of the conduits for the Jewish experience when people leave their home countries, and they've become in many ways a sort of authentic Judaism, right? There's a nostalgia that's associated with Chabad, and while they're not necessarily judgmental, they definitely push Jewish rights. So one of the ways that you are Jewish for the Chabadniks is because you practice these Jewish rights. Like, you know, they give you Shabbat candles, and you light candles on Shabbat, and their campaign is not just to get you involved and to meet other Jews, but it's also for you to do these Jewish things. And as Chabad becomes more popular, I think that becomes more of an important question, right? Do people do more of these rites, and then do they feel more Jewish? Do they feel like they're better Jews as they're more involved with Chabad? The immigrant community, Chabad has done, they're very nimble, and they do and in the same way that immigrant communities have always, or immigrants have always looked towards churches or synagogues or sort of houses of worship or organized religious institutions as places as for material help, right? For resources, and also for networks. Chabad is able to provide that for new immigrants in ways that local synagogues often are not, because there's no red tape. And as a result, you know, it's likely that over time people will become more religious.
What's interesting too, to connect it to the academic field that Kirsten was talking about, although in a very different way, is you see these Chabads cropping up at different universities, serving kind of students who maybe third, fourth generation Jews who are very modern and secular in many ways, who would not belong to synagogue, but here are going to, and then it seems like mostly it's happening at MSU. I know it's happening at the colleges my kids are in. Everywhere. And it's surprisingly like they're seem to be drawn by the sense of intimacy, where you can have a nice meal and come together in a communal, intimate fashion, and it's more like the coziness of it, even though they might differ in terms of gender, roles and other things, right? So it's very interesting, that phenomena. I wanted to give you all an opportunity, since I see one more question. And so after that, I also wanted to give you an opportunity to kind of respond to each other and ask each other questions as well, because that would be all interesting for all of us to hear as well, if there aren't, lots of questions cropping up. So Farid Farhadi says, is it true that problems started with the Druze from the Ivanov era in Russia? If so, how many sentences would you explain, please? So I don't know if that's clear question or not, and we might ask you to clarify if it's not. But yeah.
I guess that question was about the Romanov dynasty in Russia, which indeed fluctuated in its relationship to its the Jewish minority in Russia, took a stick and then a carrot and then a stick again and then a pitchfork. But so it really fluctuated in its ways to deal with the Jewish question. And there was Nikolai I with its mandatory conscription, but then there was Alexander II, who said, no, I will let Jews leave the Pale and actually reside in the interior, go to universities, work in different, different lines of work. But after 1881, after he was assassinated, and actually even the decade before he was assassinated, there was already a malaise among the Jewish intelligentsia, some of whom would form the very early Zionists, by the way, because as the Israeli historian Anita Shapira wrote about the Russian Jewish intelligentsia, she said Zionism always starts among those who were very assimilated and then got rebuffed, got rejected. She called it the rejected suitor kind of phenomenon that you can see. But after 1881, when Alexander III comes into power, and definitely Nicholas II, they're much more authoritative and they clamp down. And by 1903, 1906, when you have from Kishinev until Bialystok of 1906, the Russian government is implicit. It actually looks the other way, if not participates in pogroms, trying to deflect public anger for the losing war against Japan, the abortive revolution of 1905, and so on. So I think if that's what the question was about, I hope that I answered that.
Any of you have questions for each other, or in terms of your presentations, or questions that arise, even though you've read the chapters, as you hear them again and kind of hear the chapters together? Are there further questions that arise? Go ahead, Kirsten, and please just.
Well, so I just wanted to say, I mean, a number of the ideas that both of you had, so the idea of nonlinear acculturation for people actually who I think came unexcited to be in East Lansing and then actually grew. Like I like the idea of thinking about that along the lines of the people I look at. And Laura, it's a number of your ideas, especially the ways that new immigrants alter Jewish culture, are things that I'm going to take with me. So I really appreciate it. I have a question for you, Laura, which is just the lack of proximal host. Like, I'm not a sociologist, I'm a historian. So like the terms that sociologists use sometimes, are interesting to me. So I'm curious, when you say that like Latino Jews or Jews, I believe it was Jews, Israeli Jews, didn't find a proximal host. They didn't find synagogues to their liking, I guess is what that means, or comfortable. I'm curious if they experienced discrimination, if you know that, if there was a certain sense of exclusion that they experienced, and if that was a part of it. And also if they create synagogues themselves, which you sort of maybe hinted at a little bit at the end, but I'm not sure whether it actually was institutionalized in that way, or has been, or if there's a making of that.
Sure. So I think, yes, I can speak more to the case of Latino Jews. And just this morning, this Chabad project, I'm sort of monothematic here, but I'm in Miami right now, and in Miami there's a large number of Latin American Jewish immigrants, and what's happened is that Latin American Jewish immigrants when they came here, were used to sending their kids to Jewish schools. And over time, the Jewish schools here and the JCC became very Latino. So American schools started saying, oh, I don't understand the language, or their culture's a little bit different. And just this morning, I asked somebody, I said, well, do they stop sending their kids? They said, well, they don't stop sending, the Americans don't stop sending their kids. They just don't they'll stop enrolling, right? So they sort of age, they'll graduate, and then there's not a new influx of American kids. So what ends up happening is that new communities are formed, right? In large part because there's such a huge influx, but also because other people are leaving. And is it discrimination? I mean, discrimination is the kind of term that they would say, you're not allowed to have this job because I'm not going to hire you because you're Mexican. Does that happen? I don't know. But is there a sort of do they separate themselves? That happens for sure. There are some there are some historical documents that show that the Federation, for example, back when the Cuban Jews came over before 1965, did not necessarily help Cuban Jews in the way that we would like to think that they did. And we know that this is also, to some extent, happened with some of the Argentine Jews that came over. So individually, the synagogues might have helped, but not necessarily the sort of larger federation didn't step in the same way that they stepped in to help Jews from the former Soviet Union, for example. So that kind of institutional support didn't happen for Mexican Jews. It's not necessarily happening for Venezuelan Jews, for lots of reasons that I'm not going to keep on going. But yeah, they do form new sub-ethnic or sort of new communities, and very interesting ones. And in Miami in particular, you actually have a number of different immigrant groups that come together and form these sort of like immigrant Jewish communities, right? That are different than American Jewish communities. And I don't think I answered that. No, go ahead.
We just have, before others jump in, we had a kind of follow-up question for you, Laura, about like, what would you call it if there's this separation that may not exactly, be legal discrimination? If you could elaborate on kind of how you think through what the separation is. Yeah.
So I think that oftentimes the same thing, the way, racism, somebody can be a racist and not necessarily discriminate, right? In the same way that you can have preconceived notions of what somebody is, but you don't necessarily act on them. Is a separate, so oftentimes we see this in literature on racism, where folks are not moving into a neighborhood or staying in their own neighborhoods because they want to be like people like them. That's a racist act. Is it discriminatory? Is maybe. I think, is this are people pulling their kids out of school? I'm not sure if that's, I'm not sure if the people in that school are not having opportunities because somebody else, the American Jews, are pulling them out of school. Sure, that's discriminatory. Is it racist? Again, then we would have to argue that we need to think about how we think about race, and I think that would be a difficult argument within the Jewish context. So I think there's semantics, and we could think about them more in a maybe, but I'm not sure that I have the space or time to think about or to talk about them here.
I think, Gil, you were going to go next, and any of you who want to ask each other questions or respond to each other. Yeah. Thank you.
It's a question to Laura. I find the very definition of Latino Jews intriguing, because what we learned, of course, this panel, and we talk about identity is always situational. You're born in Baghdad, you're not an Iraqi Jew. You're not a Mizrahi Jew for sure. It's situational, created in Israel. When you meet other people, you're born in Vilna, you're not a Lithuanian Jew or an Eastern European, you're part of a smaller. So, and I'm thinking those Latino Jews, or as we call them, Spanish-speaking Jews, of course, in Buenos Aires, they're not Latino Jews. In Mexico City, they're not. To what extent such a community indeed forms, is established? Do they identify first and foremost as Latinos, or do they still separate themselves according to the country of origin?
So I really, I guess in a minute, I'll try to answer this quickly. It depends. I think it depends. No, just like non-Jewish Latinos, Latino is one of the many identities, right? They're sometimes Latino, and sometimes they're Mexican, and sometimes they're none of these, and sometimes they're American or Mexican American, and it sort of depends on the situation, and there are other factors that depend, and that same thing happens among Latino Jews. But there are two things that happen here. You come here, and this idea of proximal host, or finding somebody that's like you, right? So we would think that an Argentine Jew would come here and think, oh, well, I'm Jewish, and I'm going to be part of the American Jewish community, and that doesn't happen. Like, it doesn't happen for the Israeli Jews, because there are so many ethnic differences, right? And so what ends up happening is that on the one hand, they're absolutely Jewish, they're absolutely Argentine, yet they sort of find this other we have a top-down classification system where the census very clearly asks, were you born in any of these countries? Therefore, you're Latino. And so that is sort of one way that we incorporate these structural ethnic assignments. And the nice thing about being Latino is that you can be anything else and Latino, right? So you can be white and Latino. So it's almost easier that way to say that. That doesn't mean that they all will do that. But sociologists tend to say, okay, well, a group becomes a real group, like a real larger ethnic group, when we start to see people intermarry, right? Like marrying across groups. And what we find is that over time, that's what happens, particularly in areas where there's a large concentration of Latin American Jewish immigrants. So in Miami, for example, once the social networks begin to include, Mexican Jews and Venezuelan Jews and Argentine Jews. And remember, we talked, we said this before, we were talking about like the rights that we create a sort of bridge, an identity bridge. So now all of these things rise to the top: the Spanish language, the being Jewish and from Latin America in the United States, the how we perceive different values, the speaking Hebrew with a Spanish accent, maybe. All of these things sort of rise to the top, and these are the sorts of things that people hang on to create this new identity.
Well, we're nearing the end, so I wanted to thank all of you for a very stimulating, thought-provoking discussion where I still have lots of questions in my mind, and I read part of the book and I want to go back and read another part. And I know many people in the audience already read the book. If you haven't, I encourage you to get Wandering Jews, Global Jewish Migration. The MSU library has it, other libraries have it, or you can purchase it. Steve, would you like to kind of finish us off with a few final comments of yours?
Sure, I'm excited to see all the different points of view, and I just wish all the other authors could be here as well, because they all have very interesting papers that triangulate in various ways. So in some ways, I mean, the book is about the past, but also the future, and how the notion of there's Jewish immigrants that didn't come from the alley stock, in 1912 or something like that. It's an ongoing peripatetic group with different identities and origins and backgrounds that keeps reinventing itself in various ways. So those are some comments. The excitement and diversity of presentations and comments are a real message from this event. And so thank you very much for supporting it and organizing.
Thank you all. Thank you all who were with us for 2 hours. To me, it didn't feel like 2 hours, which is a good sign at the end of the day. And please join us if you'd like on Sunday for the analysis of the Israeli elections, on Thursday for our annual Holocaust lecture, and on Friday for our great research from our students. And hope you all enjoying kind of the end of your semester. Thank you so much to all the fantastic speakers. Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much.
Thank you.